I thought it might make for either an interesting or tedious video. That's to be determined. If we go back and look at some of the stones that I've cut over this past year, where in 2021 I cut one stone on December 20th and 21st of 2021. I cut this 11.49 carat neodymium yag at Mike Zinsky's workshop, and then went home and bought this Raytech Shaw faceting machine from eBay. And in that time, in 2022, I've cut somewhere in the neighborhood of 53 stones. The second stone was also a neodymium yag in the same cut as the first one. I think it turned out fairly well, and so I just kept going from there. I didn't really have much of a rhyme or reason for the stones that I chose, or the designs that I chose, to any large extent. The second stone was an Idaho garnet. The fourth stone was actually an agate, where I was trying to break in this 1200 topper lap. I heard that might be a good way to get rid of some of the burrs and excess diamond on the top, so it didn't scratch too much. And I was kind of a foolhardy in my approach, where I really thought one of these Idaho garnets would lighten up if I had just the right cut. None of them did, of course. And so I have a lot of very dark garnets that I don't really have anything to do with. The exception is a very small 3mm stone that I don't have in my collection, because I gave that to my mother-in-law for a sort of birthstone necklace for her grandchildren. Stone number 8 is a nice smoky quartz in Mike's reverse brilliant design, which is probably a design that I've cut most often out of any other design. I actually still haven't cut a full-on, just the standard round brilliant, just because I like his cut. And, a standard round brilliant, you can get that at any jeweler shop, so why would you buy it from a amateur faceter, where you could probably get it cheap from something that's been cut in a cutting warehouse overseas. Here's another garnet. These ones are a couple of 33 and number 5 are grouped together because they're very small Montana sapphires, and they have a couple of fractures in them as well, so they wouldn't be great for heat treating, I don't think. And then I decided to go big with this almost 30 carat neodymium yag in Mike's design. I don't know that that'll work out really well with the backlighting that was on there, but on the display stand you can see I went from very tiny to huge. And next up is an amethyst, which was a pretty good size. It's a square cushion with kind of a step cut top and a more brilliant design bottom, so it's a mixed cut. And I didn't realize it, I was still pretty new. This was my 12th stone, more or less. It windows very quickly as you go side to side, and that's because I chose the design that was designed for refractive index stones of higher than quartz. I think it might have been for garnet or something like that. This was an attempt at a faceted cross stone, as kind of a test for my daughter's godparents. I didn't end up liking this design as much as another one that I cut in a bigger stone, so I have that in my collection still. A very small, pale aquamarine there. Stone number 16 is my first Portuguese cut in I think it's a modified design. I forget if I modified it or if I might have just left off one of the tiers of facets just because I didn't have enough room. I cut a number of topaz, more or less in close proximity, because that was one thing I wound up doing, was cutting a few of the same style of stone to kind of get a feel for how they worked. And I liked this number 17 Mexican topaz. It doesn't have a table, it just comes to a point at where the table should be. It's a Jubilee design, I think it might be called. But unfortunately, a lot of those topaz will fade in the sunlight, and so I don't really want to sell those. And that one was my first laser ruby, but they are kind of a pain to polish on my current setup. I have to get a better sapphire/corundum polishing setup. Stone number 20. Didn't have any schiller or anything, but it was a pretty goldeny yellow color. And so let's see, topaz again. And this one is one of the ones that I tested out in the sun, so it's bleached almost white. There's maybe a slight brownish tinge to it left, but it's mostly white. And stone number 22 was an apatite from the Hermiston Rock Hound show. It was, I think, $2 or $3 for the apatite, and it was a pretty clean stone, so I decided to cut it. And I actually liked how it cut really nice. And stone 23 was from a faceting Discord chat forum that I'm part of, where someone released this design that they called Harbor Coat, and I actually made a video on that where it's just going through all the steps without actually showing the design. But that turned out really bright and sparkly, which is nice. Stone 24 is another amethyst. Unfortunately, a lot of the amethysts that I have are fractured in some way or another. This one might have turned out relatively clean. I don't see any major flaws immediately. And this one was not too difficult to cut, but it does look very interesting. It's a tessellation design from Arya Akvan, and it's got a basically rounded dome top. Stone 26 is also an amethyst. I think I see a fracture near the table on this one, unfortunately. And this was my first Portuguese style cut in the laser ruby. And then I got a hold of some X cubes. This is stone 28, which I cut in an opposing bar design, kind of that pixel effect. And this was one of a series of X cubes that I cut. I cut another X cube with it oriented in a slightly different orientation in the terms of where the X lines up on the girdle versus the table. And that stone I wound up selling after showing it off at the club. This was another, this is a sunstone in a checkerboard top design, which I like the checkerboard tops. I think they work well in sunstone. Stone number 30 is actually a fairly light red garnet, which is from Montana, which is probably why it actually lightened up rather than the Idaho ones that are staying dark. And then right after that, I was like, oh, that garnet worked really well in that cut, so I'll just try another garnet from Idaho in that design. And it didn't really lighten up as much as I thought it would. And I think around July or so, I found Jeff Graham's, some of his publicly released designs, which include signature number 4, which is that trillion. And it looks like there's a fracture or two in that stone. Oh no, that was just dust. But I really liked his signature number 4, which he likes as well for light colored aquamarine. So I've cut that 2 or 3 times, and that was one of the stones that I did as a giveaway recently. And stone 35 is when I acquired some synthetic corundum in the number 5 color. I got a half bowl of that, so I've cut a few stones in that cut, or in that style. This first one is actually a design that I made, which is Squarian B, which is a square Barian pavilion design. And it wound up being not quite as bright and sparkly as I wanted, and so I decided to try the cut, or the stone, in the reverse brilliant design, since I kind of knew how that performed. And even in that cut, that works really well in a lot of ways. It didn't behave very well, and so I think it's actually because the number 5 material is fairly dark that it doesn't sparkle as much as some of the other corundums that I was used to cutting. And then stone 37 was a Voltolini design in a kind of flower petal form, which I liked a lot. So I'm definitely going to cut that design in something else in the future. And I decided to give that corundum one more go in a rectangular design. And then I went to an estate sale towards the end of the year, like September or so, and purchased a bunch of rough material, including some sunstone with a lot of nice copper schiller in it, and kind of went to work going through some of those, testing out a couple different cuts and orienting the schiller in different ways. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. For the amount of schiller that's in these stones, I actually think that orienting the schiller plane perpendicular or parallel to the table makes them look the best. I like being able to see that sparkle. Stone 52 was my rutilated quartz that I did in my giveaway. That was the sort of first prize winner, or the first selected winner. I also did an opposing bar cut in that rutilated quartz, which the pixelated effect is kind of lost, but I think it highlights the rutilated quartz really nicely. And stone 54 was an awesome design called Thousand Thistles by Martin Viala. that I think looks really cool. It looks like there's lots of shards kind of at the head of a thistle. And 55 was a peridot. I'm pretty sure that's a peridot. It cuts like I expect quartz to cut in a simple kite design, which I chose because of the shape of the stone. And then the last couple, I have 3 cuts in a triangular design that I made. At first I cut it in this synthetic corundum, the number 5 ruby, and realized it might not look that good, so I cut it in Idaho garnet and neodymium yag. And it looks really good in the yag anyway, which kind of naturally sparkles. And so those are the stones that I cut in 2022, averaging a little over a stone a week, which I will definitely not be matching in this year's output for sure. So far this year, I finished an amethyst. That was one of my previous, most recent videos, where I cut it in the reverse brilliant design, but it didn't work out very well, and so I recut it with just a step cut crown in a shallower angle. And then after finishing that amethyst, I knocked out this design in neodymium yag called Titan, which is designed by Scott Labori. It's a variation on the standard round brilliant and is really nice as well. I might cut that design again in the future. So what do we have to look forward to in 2023? Well, this is some of the rough that I've collected / been given over the past year. Let's start over here. I still got a bunch of nice Schiller sunstone. These are some quartz points that I don't know that I'll do anything with, and there's some opal potch that doesn't have any color, unfortunately. But a lot of those sunstones are nice, if flat. And there's a variety of, let's see, we got some citrine, and then this is kind of a root beer colored quartz looking thing that I got at my club bingo night as a kind of gift prize thing. A really dark amethyst, and this was actually an iolite that I started to facet and realized it was just way too fractured up and wasn't going to do anything in the light, and stopped wasting my time on it. And this was actually a stone that I didn't have in my carousel over there, but it's the terrible sunstone from the How Not to Facet video. And there's some topaz, and this is a bit of kyanite that I recently cut up. You can see the blue in there. It's kind of it's got some white on the outside edge, so there's some kind of banded of clear and blue regions, which will be interesting to cut. And kyanite is tricky because it has a very variable hardness depending on the orientation, between 4 and 7.5 or so. So that can be very difficult to cut, apparently. And I'm sort of looking forward to trying, but in other ways, not really. And I've got about as much sort of plain, clear sunstone as I can stomach, and have a little bit of citrine. I got an agate or 2 that I'm willing to chop up and try to facet. Some of these sort of translucent ones can look really nice when they're faceted. A little bit of light purple amethyst left. Mike recently gave me a little bit of facetable opal, where there's some red fire opal there, and there's a play of color in that other one that'll cut a small but hopefully interesting stone. Although opal is kind of unforgiving and it has a very low refractive index, so finding a design that works and looks nice in there can be almost impossible. But I've got a little bit of beryl, aquamarine, although a lot of what I have left is really fractured. A whole bunch of neodymium yag. As you might have noticed, I cut a lot of this stuff because it looks really cool in almost any design that's designed for yag. A whole bunch of pieces of rutilated quartz with variable rutile needles going through it. I think it's a really good balance of density of rutile, but also limited enough where you get some light and color play in there. And a bit of laser ruby. These are about 10 millimeters or so, or maybe it's 9, I can't remember exactly, but got a few pieces of that. One big chunk of smoky quartz for when I'm feeling kind of masochistic, and a couple pieces of blue zircon, which will be interesting to see how that cuts up. Zircon has a really high refractive index, so I get a lot of dispersion. A bit of obsidian, a couple of Apache tears in there from the Hat Rock Sound show, and a variation of YAG called CTH YAG, which I forget what it stands for, but it's like, but I'll put it on the screen. And it's a fairly dark green. Anyway, I'll make a video of cutting one of those for sure. And I've had this piece of synthetic alexandrite. I've had this for a while, started to work on it, and then realized that the orientation I was originally going to do wasn't going to yield good color, or I'd have to cut it a lot smaller than I wanted. And so I stopped it because it was kind of an expensive stone for its size. A little bit of Brazil topaz in both clear and almost an imperial color, heavily fractured on the inside. And I've marked some of the places to cut out where I think it would just be way too fractured to do anything with. A little bit of that number 5 corundum left. It's not my favorite material because it's so dark. It's not as sparkly as I would like. Then in the reserves, I have a couple of big chunks of neodymium YAG and CTH YAG that I'll cut some big stones with when I have a lot of spare time. But be sure to like and subscribe and keep an eye out for some of these being cut in the future.